Good to have you with us on this Wednesday edition of Ed Schultz News and Commentary. The French president making the rounds, getting support as he met with the president yesterday. He'll meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin today. And this is going to be an interesting effort, so to speak. The sanctions on Russia with Crimea and the Ukraine are going to be up at the end of next month. Can this coalition fighting against ISIS hold together and also these sanctions be in place, staying in place? This is a tightrope walk, I think, for the French president. Yesterday, President Obama lending his support and the United States' effort to fighting ISIS with the French.
We've got a coalition of 65 countries who've been active in pushing back against ISIL for quite some time. Russia right now is a coalition of two. Iran and Russia supporting Assad. But I think it's important to remember that you've got a global coalition organized. Russia's the outlier. We hope that they refocus their attention on what is the most substantial threat, and that they serve as a constructive partner.
And what will be Russia's retaliation now that the Turks have shot down a Russian fighter? One of the pilots has been recovered. But the big question is, can we defeat ISIS and can we remain safe as a globe and do it this way without ground troops? The Republicans, of course, are hecklers from the stands. They, of course, say the president isn't doing the right thing. We're not doing enough. There's not enough drones, not enough airstrikes. And, of course, we can't get this done without boots on the ground. I don't have those answers. Most Americans don't. Who's been correct on the Middle East from this country for decades? Not many. Colonel Jack Jacobs, retired MSNBC military analyst, joins us. Colonel, good to have you with us.
Hey, hi, Ed.
What can be done more than what we're doing right now without boots on the ground? And your thoughts on this 65-country coalition the president's talking about?
Well, the short answer is nothing more. Any military person will tell you that if you want to defeat somebody on the ground, particularly an outfit like ISIS that is focused on terrain, their whole ideology requires them to control terrain. Airstrikes are not going to do it. You have to have people on the ground to seize and hold terrain once the airstrikes and artillery and all that stuff have done their job. But we're not going to do that. We don't have any political will to do that. We wasted a decade or more in the Middle East not getting done any of the things that we said we were going to do, and actually increasing the turmoil in the region. What's really required here is a multinational force that's composed not of Americans or even NATO, but of the countries in the region that actually have a vested interest in seeing the place calm down. That includes Egypt, for example, who has a great air force.
Mm-hmm.
Turkey, Saudi Arabia, huge air force with American equipment, American ordnance. Iran even, but they don't seem to have much interest in getting involved, and they're sitting on the sidelines, and they're not going to contribute. But the short answer is, bombs alone are not going to do anything to anybody, and we're not going to send 100,000 or 200,000 troops there for a decade or more in order to secure the area. So it's going to require a great deal of diplomacy to forge a real coalition of people who are actually going to do something, not just countries, the 65, who are kind of interested in seeing what happens there.
Colonel, your thoughts on the aftermath of the Russian pilot being shot down by the Turks?
Well, the Russians have violated Turkish airspace many times before, been yelled at before, and they continue to do it. What the Russians are doing, and what the Russians were doing when their Su-24 was shot down, were bombing Turkmen, Turkish ethnic people who are living in Syria and who are more or less protected by the Turks. And they've been doing it for some time, violating the airspace for some time, and I think the Turks just decided that they'd had enough. The Su-24 was actually in Turkish airspace for about 4 seconds, but that was enough to take it down. That causes a great deal of difficulty there, particularly between Russia on the one hand and Turkey on the other, who ostensibly, except for the fact that they're one supporting Assad and the other one is not, who are actually inextricably intertwined in a great number of ways, including economics. So this is a big problem now, much more for Putin than it is for Turkey, because Putin's kind of painted himself into a corner with a wide variety of adventures that are not panning out very well, Ed.
How do you think the president's playing Vladimir Putin right now? I mean, he's, isolating Russia in a sense, saying that they're with Iran and we've got 60. And the backdrop of this is what's going to happen to the sanctions that are going to expire next month due to the actions of the Russians in Crimea. Will that coalition hold together? I mean, the French play a key role here, don't they?
They do indeed. This is an interesting boxing match. There's a lot of rope-a-dope on both sides here. We want to make sure that the sanctions stay in place. I think we're going to use the sanctions. The West is going to use the sanctions as bait, as trade bait, to get Russia to participate in knocking out ISIS. But Russia doesn't care about ISIS. They care about ISIS only as an enemy. Their sole objective here is not even to keep Assad in power, but to keep Assad in power long enough for both them, the Russians, and Iran to have a seat at the table when all the fighting starts. They already know that Assad's going. It's just a question of who's going to be in control of Syria once Assad goes, and Russia wants it to be Russia. So we're on the wrong side. If what we want to do is team up with Russia to knock off ISIS, that's not going to work, because our objective to get rid of Assad is totally and completely different than Russia's objective, which is to keep Assad in place long enough for Russia to influence the outcome. I have to say that we painted ourselves into a corner too. We're kind of inept. We've turned out to be the world's skull.
unfolding in Chicago and Minneapolis. That's next on Ed Schultz News and Commentary. Stay with us.
Hey folks, you've heard me talk about BioGreen Clean. I'm going to show you right now on my airplane just how tough this is. I want you to keep in mind, chemical-free, 100% plant-derived, biodegradable. It is the safest cleaner that you can get, and it's the most effective. Go to our website, wegoted.com, or go to biogreenclean.com. www.biogreenclean and order today. It's time to continue our conversation about mechanical insulation. Mechanical insulation is for the piping systems in our nation's commercial and industrial facilities. Facility owners are burning up billions of dollars through the lack of mechanical insulation on these piping systems. Call the iSave team. Insulation saves America valuable energy, and this team of energy conservation specialists is shovel-ready to save you money. Visit iSaveTeam.org to have a specialist give your plant an energy audit.
We perpetuate a culture of crime all the way from Wall Street right down to the main street in our hometowns. It's worse than it has been since FDR took control of the problem and said we can't count on industry taking care of the American labor. They probably have already engaged into some type of criminal cover-up, and the law prohibits the government from even doing anything about it.
Catch America's lawyer Mike Papantonio on YouTube at youtube.com/GoLeftTV.
Good to have you with us here on Ed Schultz News and Commentary on this Wednesday edition. Joining me now is former Senator Byron Dorgan. Senator, good to have you back with us.
Thanks, Ed. Good to be with you.
Lots of crazy stuff going on right now, and there's not a whole lot happening in the House and the Senate when it comes to fighting ISIS other than hecklers from the stands right now. Mm-hmm. I want your thoughts on the president seeking authorization of military force, but he's not getting it from the Congress. What does this mean from your perspective?
Well, as you know, nothing is happening in Washington that would require some ability to work together. I mean, it's just the issue of compromise seems to be an issue that is just off the table. But, on the Middle East and fighting ISIS and dealing with all these issues, my feeling is that the fewer American flags we plant in the sand of the Middle East, the better. That doesn't mean we shouldn't provide some significant leadership in lots of ways with our allies, but sending an American fighting force right into the cauldron of the Middle East makes little sense for this country. There's no evidence at all that is what is going to solve the issues of the Middle East. So, I hope the president is cautious. I hope we provide leadership, and I hope we work to put together coalitions and so on. But, this ISIS issue, ultimately the Middle East is going to have to resolve much of this in the Middle East.
The terrorist attack on Paris and the involvement of the French now and the airstrikes by the Russians, is this going to help the coalition? Is this going to, and what kind of an effect do you think that this would have on NATO or upping the ante to go after ISIS? How do you think this plays?
Well, this is, the attack in Paris is changing a lot of things. Just as, for example, when ISIS was on video beheading people, that kind of savagery and the beheading of captives on video, it had a profound impact around the world as a method of communicating from ISIS. The same is true with respect to the attacks in Paris. I find it really interesting, the issue of the refugees, in the aftermath of the Paris attacks, the refugees, the question about whether some terrorists might come in with refugees to various countries. And the call politically to close borders, and someone suggested let in only Christians. I mean, it is so Byzantine, it's just hard to describe it. Do you remember when we had the Ebola scare?
Yeah.
We had some of the same people were the first out there saying we've got to shut down the American borders. It is so thoughtless in terms of how some of these people approach these issues. These are serious, difficult issues, and it requires grown-ups to think through them and come up with solutions that make sense for our country.
Well, unless I'm mistaken, every single Republican candidate, other than Trump, is saying put boots on the ground in the Middle East. There is no political appetite or political will in this country to see that happen. So how does that play in this election year?
But many of those who talk about boots in the ground, they've talked about boots in the ground with respect to every trouble spot in the world. I mean, you just add them up. It's always boots in the ground. You know, again, I think that the American people have little appetite for that. It doesn't mean that we should withdraw from the world. It doesn't mean we shouldn't provide some significant leadership. But look, no country that I'm aware of has been successful sending invading armies or sending armies rather into Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, and sending boots on the ground, a lot of boots on the ground to Syria. Boy, that, in my judgment, that is a serious, serious mistake for this country. And again, Ed, there are a lot of ways to provide significant leadership for this country, and you know, I hope that the president is working through that. He's quieter than people would like him to be, but you know what? In the face of all of these Republican candidates saying send troops, send boots to the ground, frankly, I'm kind of pleased that the president is saying, you know what? That we're not going to do that. We've got a strategy. We're working through this strategy. The fact is, ISIS has less territory now than they had before. Obviously, the Paris attack has ramped this up a lot, and it's a serious issue, but this country needs to be involved, but not with boots on the ground.
Senator Byron Dorgan, always good to visit. Thank you, Byron. Appreciate it. We'll do it again. You bet. Thank you. Lots of unrest in Chicago and in Minneapolis. When we come back, we'll take a look at what happened overnight, and also Eric Dyson, professor at Georgetown, joins us on what is the remedy. Stay with us. Ed Schultz News and Commentary brought to you by Communication Workers of America, Alliance for American Manufacturing, BioGreen Clean, and the iSave team.
From the steel mills of Pennsylvania, to the auto factories of Michigan, to the modern makers movement, manufacturing makes our nation great. I'm Scott Paul, president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. We bring business and labor together to advocate for policies that everyone can agree on. Together, we can strengthen manufacturing and create good-paying American jobs. Help us keep it made in America.
Good to have you with us here on Ed Schultz News and Commentary. This year, 2015, I think is going to be remembered as a year where protests and minorities who are fighting for social justice and their clashes with police have just gone absolutely overboard. There are two cities in the spotlight right now, and that's Chicago and also Minneapolis. In Chicago, a police officer, Jason Van Dyke, 37 years old, has been arrested and brought up on first-degree murder charges for the killing of LaJuan McDonald, and this was a year ago. This police video, the dash cam, was released, and of course, residents are furious because it shows him being shot 16 times. This is Police Chief Jerry McCarthy talking about last night's incident.
Do people have a right to be angry? People have a right to protest. People have a right to free speech, but they do not have a right to commit criminal acts. And at the end of the day, the Chicago Police Department is trained for, and we're one of the world leaders in mass demonstrations. We're prepared to facilitate people's First Amendment right to free speech, but we will be intolerant of criminal behavior here in the city of Chicago. And we expect that we're going to have community support to facilitate whatever protests come our way. And I'm really confident in the community as far as being behind us.
It all sounds good, but the videotape is ominous, and the actions in the street and the unrest that's taking place has to be addressed. And their issues have to be addressed. I go back to this. I go back to education. I think when you're picking and choosing neighborhoods, when you're shutting down schools of low-income neighborhoods, it sends a real message, and that's where the unrest in the heart and the soul begins, and it changes a community, and everything is intensified, and everything comes under the microscope. And who knows where it's going to end, but cooler heads must prevail, and issues must be addressed. For more on this, I want to turn to my great friend, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, who's a professor at Georgetown University. Also, he's author, contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. Michael, good to have you with us.
Ed, always good to be on with you, my friend.
How do we throw cold water on this? What is the issue here? We've also got Minneapolis burning with unrest as well, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what's happening here, and what's the remedy, Doctor?
Well, you just made a brilliant point about linking all of these things together. Neighborhoods that are demoralized, that are, seen as something that's disposable, get that message and they internalize that, Ed. And on top of that, when the police chief says we are intolerant of crime, he means of everyone except perhaps his own police force, because this young man was mowed down in cold blood. The fact is, I wish the police would finally say, he did say that people have a right to be angry and the like, but we are intolerant of. Start with your own police force. Say we are intolerant of this kind of behavior that appears to be morally reprehensible, and we will begin there. And then we will also demand the same thing of the citizens of this particular city. It seems to me that the police are intolerant of the no-snitch policy among citizens in this country, and yet they are tolerant of no snitching among themselves for a year. This video was held in safekeeping. The police who saw that knew what happened, and yet they came with the same narrative they've always had. I was afraid of my life. This young man didn't cooperate with the police, and as a result of that, we had to kill him. The black people in Chicago and across this country have very little faith in the ability of the police to exercise their justly sworn duties to uphold the law, to protect, and to serve. And as a result of that, you see this kind of carnage going on and the kind of social protest that overflows where the anger of the people it engulfs communities. And those legitimate rights, as the police captain said, chief said, and I'm glad he said it, to protest sometimes then transmogrifies and gets real nasty in terms of the lethal intensity of what the people feel. So you said something brilliant here. Let's talk about education of the police department and of the broader citizenry. Let's talk about the economic and social injustice that they confront. Let's talk about warehousing people so that they become, they send them to detention as opposed to trying to figure out what their problems are, and then they go to jail.
I just think, Doctor, that the eroding of society, the eroding of opportunities, the absolute choosing and picking of neighborhoods of who gets resources and who doesn't based on property tax is the birthplace of all of this crap that's going on.
Well, there's no doubt about that. And then when people are, in these densely populated areas where little resources are to be had, then you see a predictable outcome of heightened crime and a predictable outcome of the inability of the police to really use community policing to deal with these neighborhoods. Community policing, Ed, has been proved to work far better than bringing in people who have no relationship to a particular community to police it.
In the city of Minneapolis, there has also been a shooting and a death, and there have been multiple protests in recent days. Misty Noor is a spokesperson for Black Lives Matter in Minneapolis. She calls the shootings on Monday evening a planned hate crime. Here it is.
What happened last night was a planned hate crime and an act of terrorism against activists who have been occupying the 4th Precinct to demand justice for Jamar Clark, a black man shot and killed by the Minneapolis Police Department. Despite earlier statements from police about the impending threat from white supremacists, the police instead maced citizen journalists and peaceful protesters. They made disparaging comments to those at the protests instead of taking the threat seriously. We reiterate that we have zero faith in this police department's desire to keep our community safe.
It's almost a science right now on how to handle crowds after a police shooting. This is new territory for America, but it's commonplace. Put it together for us, Doctor.
No doubt. I mean, the young lady spoke eloquently there. about the fact that if you've been informed that these people who are white supremacists are going to be in the neighborhood to cause a stir, yes, again, we have first right amendments of people to peacefully assemble, but you also have to be aware of the potential for violence that comes not only from the people who are gathered, but from those people who seek to interrupt the duly, the rightful right to protest. So I think, first of all, we got to acknowledge that. Secondly, you said something important there again. We've developed this science of dealing with crowds that gather to protest their right. And so, again, what we have to see is that, on the one hand, we got to balance our ability and our need and our right to say what is going on is wrong, it's problematic, and must be addressed. And on the other hand, obviously, communities are concerned about safety and the like. But when you spoke earlier about these same factors being there, lack of resources, lack of public attention, the refusal to acknowledge that what's going on here is wrong. It's like what happened in Katrina, Ed, when we said then, over 10 years ago, that if this had happened in a whiter, richer neighborhood, this kind of thing would not have been tolerated for citizens to be left behind. Well, it wouldn't be tolerated for this kind of occupation by a police force in cities where the real justice is arrest the people who do the wrong. That's undeniable. At the same time, treat people with human decency and respect. And when we have images like the one in Chicago where the young man is basically shot down in cold blood, and in Minneapolis where, again, peaceful protesters are being assaulted by gun-wielding white supremacists, we have a problem in this country, and we have got to confront it directly and head-on so that we can balance the need for safety and security of all with the demand for the rightful place to protest the injustice that occurs.
Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, always great to visit. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it very much. We'll do it again.
Love you, my friend. Thank you.
All right. Always great with us. Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, opinion writer for the New York Times and also political analyst for MSNBC and professor at Georgetown. This is Ed Schultz News and Commentary, brought to you by Communication Workers of America, Alliance for American Manufacturing, BioGreen Clean, and the iSave team. Have a great Thanksgiving. We're going to take a few days off. We'll be back with you on Monday morning.